Welcome to the Make a Mental Note podcast, where mental health professionals share information and perspectives that illuminate, educate, and is worthy of a mental note. And now your host, Chris Quarto.
Hi everyone, this is Chris Quarto, and welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. Today's mental health tip has to do with adapting to stressors. If you think about the normal course of a day, you encounter a lot of different stressors, some of which you have control over, some of which you don't. And I guess the one that I wanted to talk about today is the stressor that you don't have control over. And of course, your body reacts to these and you feel all tense and uptight, and you wish that you just didn't have to deal with it, but you do. So a couple of things that you can do just to kind of regain a sense of control. You can do this by changing your expectations and your attitude about these situations. Now, I talked about one of these before on a previous podcast, and that has to do with reframing, cognitive reframing, which is looking at events from a different perspective, usually from a more positive perspective. So if you're, say, in the grocery store and it's on a Saturday morning and there are all these people here and you just can't get through, you just want to get the shopping done and over with, this is a situation where you might want to look at it from a different perspective and tell yourself something like, this is my time just to kind of slow down. I'm always on the go during the weekday, but this is a time I'm just going to slow down, and it's okay. And just to kind of take a more leisurely pace through the grocery store and telling yourself that it's actually okay to do this, that it's good for your mental health to slow down. So I think that's a good way of kind of reframing the situation. Another thing is just to consider the big picture. Take a perspective of stressful situations. Ask yourself, how is this really that important in the big picture in the long run? Will this really matter, a couple of months down the road or in a year? Is it really worth me getting all this upset over this thing? And of course, usually the answer is no, it's not that big of a deal. So I think taking a look at the big picture is important. And perhaps the last thing you could do is just taking a look at what your standards are for yourself and adjusting them. A lot of people are perfectionists, and this adds a lot of stress to life. And so take a look at situations where you tend to demand perfection of yourself and what kind of stress that causes for you. And is it possible to stop demanding perfection, at least in certain situations, and set more reasonable standards for yourself? Sometimes it's important to learn to be okay with this is good enough for now. So these are my mental health tips for the day, and I hope you find them helpful. Okay, let's go ahead and get to the podcast interview with Cameron Carpenter. I'd like to introduce my guest for today, Cameron Carpenter. Cameron is a counselor who practices at the Counseling and Relationship Center of Murfreesboro in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And Cameron, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks.
Well, I always start off the podcast by asking guests a little bit about themselves, what they do, those types of things. So maybe you could just fill in the mental note-taking audience about what you do for a living.
Okay. Well, I am a counselor. Specifically, I am working towards licensure as a licensed professional counselor with the Mental Health Service Provider designation. Mm-hmm. I am currently temporarily licensed in Tennessee, pending just a few more supervision hours and client contact hours. So
all right.
I'm basically there, but just, finishing that stuff up. I've already passed all the boards and everything and all the tests, and I'm doing pretty well with that.
That's great. So you're getting your start in this whole big field of counseling. That's really exciting to hear.
Yeah, it's a little harrowing at times, and I started out a little bit in community mental health earlier, but I'm in private practice now, like you said, and,
all right.
And it's a different environment.
So what kinds of clients do you see in private practice, Cameron?
Ooh, well, I see a large range of folks. I see people just looking for basic growth counseling or just needing someone to talk to about some struggles that they're
Uh-huh.
having all the way up to your quote unquote standard people suffering from depression, anxiety, life transitions, things like that. And I also see one of my particular things that I really like. I see a lot of adolescents.
Hmm.
Uh, Parents sometimes bring their younger kids in, and really I feel like I can help those guys a lot. Just I have a fairly decent background with adolescents, and that's another big group that I think is underserved at the moment. So
Yeah, so you're getting a lot of great experience there. I mean, you're seeing a lot of different people, different age ranges who are
mm,
having different types of issues. Working with adolescents, it's that can be a challenge at times, and maybe we'll be able to get into that a little bit later into the interview. But it's really exciting to hear how just the diversity of the clientele that you're seeing there. Well, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about your decision to enter the helping profession, Cameron, and different people have different reasons for why they go into the field of counseling. So maybe you could share with the mental note takers what motivated you to go into that direction. What's your story?
sure. So um, early on in this is back in high school for
Uh huh.
me, many years ago. My junior year, I took a like an intro psychology course.
Yeah.
The teacher that I had was generally just one of the best teachers I've had in a while. And again, this is high school, so it's not super in depth, but she was just very good about getting us involved. And it was very intriguing stuff. And of course, high school, I mean, there's always drama and things like that
Oh
going
yeah.
on.
Yeah.
And, I always found myself drawn to, I guess, the human condition. And I had friends who I saw early on that just really responded well to having someone to talk to.
Ah.
And so junior year that happened. I kind of started moving towards that idea, but college I started going off to the side a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Started a pre-med program thinking I would do psychiatry.
Ah.
And uh, maybe a year or two into the pre-med stuff, I realized psychiatry isn't really where I wanted to go. Nothing against the psychiatrists. I love them to death. But
Sure.
they're doing more medication management, stuff like that. And I really found I was drawn to the people. Like I wanted to be on the front lines, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
and help those folks out and really talk to them, build that relationship, and just do a lot of stuff like that. So I started with the psychology program at MTSU.
Uh huh.
And again, same thing, kind of went through it a little bit, had some really great classes, all sort of stuff. I did finish my bachelor's in psychology, but as it were, I actually ended up talking to you, Dr. Quarto, and convinced me of a really great program that had just really started to come to its fruition, and that was the counseling program.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, realistically, the rest is history. I joined up, and it was fantastic. It was
Yeah.
exactly where I wanted to go.
And I think that's interesting that you kind of look back at your history, and for you, it was a psychology teacher in high school who really got things going for you.
Oh,
And
no
I,
doubt.
and I think that, and that's the case, I think, for a lot of us. I know that I had teachers early on, high school and in college, in particular in college in my bachelor's program, where there was just something about them or the way that they presented the material. And of course, the material itself is quite fascinating too. So I think for a lot of people, it does start earlier. In fact, I think for people in the audience, some people who are considering going into the field might think to themselves, well, you know what? It even started a lot earlier for me, and so I think that becomes part of maybe a start of an identity as a professional. And of course, as you were talking about, going into the master's program of professional counseling and really solidifying that until where you are today as a professional counselor doing this stuff. So it's really neat to see that kind of progression.
Mhm.
Well, you've had a lot of experience or a diversity of experience working with different types of people so far. And I wonder in your work if you found that there are similarities in the types of issues that people address with you or come in with, talk to you about. What's your take on why people have the problems that they do, Cameron?
Ooh, well,
how much time do I have, right?
right. I mean, generally speaking, I mean, the human condition is fraught with imperfection, I suppose. So if you're looking for my overall major theme of why people seek counseling and need counseling, it's, we all can stand to improve.
Sure.
Is the basic idea. But realistically, there's not really a unified concept, I suppose, of why people seek counseling.
Uh-huh.
And I do very much ascribe to the idea that every person's unique in whatever they're bringing to the table, like
Sure.
whether it be, past trauma or future anxiety or just struggles in the here and the now.
Right.
And really, again, it stems from that idea of, struggle and whatnot. But generally speaking, I suppose my own take on it is we don't sometimes prepare ourselves and our children and other people around us for the reality of what's going on, which is why I ascribe to, all sort of different stuff. But it's where I really liked, the cognitive therapies and logic-based stuff. And I also liked reality therapies. Although I don't necessarily just stick to those, but
Sure.
I like how they explain stuff. The idea that people have irrational thoughts, or they're suffering from invasive thoughts, or whatever the case may be. I think a lot of it stems from that, whether it be at their own hands or at the hands of people who might have hurt them in the past, or whatever the case may be. And I'm not saying everybody has to come from a negative concept either. I mean, there's plenty of people I see that just want normal growth counseling, and they just need someone to kind of be a sounding board. So,
right. Well, yeah. So what I hear you saying, there are bits and pieces of this. Is, I think I agree that people who come in, they're struggling with something, and the things that people struggle with could really be dependent on, I guess, their own experiences, their own unique experiences. And I like the fact that you had mentioned that you see people as being unique, and you try to work within their uniqueness, or what makes them special, or that type of stuff. So I really appreciate hearing you say that. And the other thing I heard you say is that people have problems or difficulties sometimes dealing with reality, or what they're confronted with at any given point in time. And some of those things may have stemmed from things that happened in the past, or things that are happening here and now. And that really, one of the things that you're trying to do, I think, is to listen to how people, how they think about these experiences that they've had, and whether or not some of the things they're thinking about are kind of off base, or maybe they're not realistic. Is that kind of how you view this?
Absolutely. In most cases. Again, I don't ascribe to a particular school of thought, but
right.
Absolutely. There is a lot to be said about what people really conceptualize and really think about, because, like you said, the reality doesn't match up with the expectations, or vice versa, or anything of that nature. Thoughts are very peculiar things. They can control a lot of things, and they can really exacerbate a lot of problems.
Sure, exactly. Well, mental note takers, think about this a little bit. What are your beliefs? What are your expectations that might be causing you problems? Are there things that perhaps your parents had told you in the past, things about you that you still believe are true to this day? And do those beliefs create problems for you in relationships or in things that you do? Those are all good things to reflect on. And I think, Cameron, that those are the types of things that you might help people with in the way that you approach counseling. Not in all cases, but at least in some cases, your general approach.
Absolutely.
Yeah. How about your recipe for success. We always talk on this podcast about how therapists go about working with clients, and everybody has a slightly different way of counseling, and finding that there are different approaches that seem to work better with some clients than others. But if you were kind of think along the lines of what you do with a typical client, somebody who's coming in with some sort of problem, maybe it's an adolescent, maybe it's somebody else, but what's your general approach to kind of get them from point A, where they're coming in with this problem, they're not quite sure what to do, to point B, where they've talked to you and they've really benefited from the work that you've done with them? Maybe you could talk a little bit about what your recipe is for success.
Sure. So again, just to reiterate the idea, everybody is a unique case. And even with that idea in mind, I very much ascribe to client-centered therapy as well. The idea that people come in all shapes, sizes, forms, all sort of different stuff, and they come as they are.
Mm-hmm.
And so my recipe from the initial get-go is really not so much a problem mentality, but more an invitation.
I see.
And I generally try and give a certain amount of permissiveness off. Like, I try and approach people wherever they are. If they want to talk to me about certain things, that's where we'll go. If they don't want to talk about certain things initially, that's fine. And as an example, I often tell people, even in the first session, like, hey, we're doing all this paperwork, you're telling me all these issues, but realistically, you've known me for all of, X number of minutes.
Uh-huh.
And it's okay that you're not going to open up to me about this stuff yet. It takes time. It takes a relationship. And I start off with that. And again, very, very permissive in that concept.
Mm-hmm.
As I move through the relationship, obviously, it changes up. You were about to say something?
Yeah, I think that basically your approach to starting off this relationship with the client is, and I like this word that you used, was an invitation. That this is something that you're inviting them to do, and it really places the control in their hands, doesn't it? That it's really up to them, and it's really that it's not something that you're prescribing to them, that this is something that you're inviting them to do in conjunction with you. And I like that this is how you start off your counseling sessions. So this is essentially, we're kind of talking about this point A at this point, about what seems to work for you, and it really starts from the beginning, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Well, it has to, by definition. People are coming with all sort of stuff. They're not sure where they're going. They don't know. They may not even know what they're coming in for.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea there is, I have to make sure that they do feel invited, and that whatever their issues are, that they're not alone, and they are not insurmountable in most cases. Like all of that type of stuff. I really have to instill a lot of that early on. And of course, it becomes a relationship. I have to instill in them that as a byproduct of inviting them to do the work, it is their work.
Mm-hmm.
The old adage, I suppose, is if the counselor is doing more work than the client, then nothing's really going to happen there.
Exactly. Well, yeah, and you said that sometimes you work with adolescents, and so, I wonder, when you work with them, how they respond to that invitation that you were talking about. That is it hard to get them to kind of buy into counseling, to be part of this, or do you find that really that it's not an issue at all, that they're kind of just willing to talk and work with you? How does that work kind of in this whole A to B process that we're talking about here?
It really does depend, but generally speaking, and I don't know if it's my particular personality or my life choices, but I do have an affinity for adolescents in particular. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why, I've just kind of settled into that. I didn't really start out as an adolescent counselor, but I do have a lot that I've had very good success stories with.
Uh-huh.
When I say adolescent, I do mean they're still, quote unquote, children/minors, but they're
Mm-hmm.
usually, 12 to 17. It's the kids that are really starting to figure out what the world is and things like
Yeah.
that. And really, like, I don't really feel like there's a super difficulty there. I do have some that are resistant or reluctant, but I do take an approach to, again, invite them. It's not so much of a, well, your parents have drug you here and you're going to have this type mentality rather, and it's instead like, I'm here for you, and regardless of what's going on, regardless of what mom and dad are saying, I'm still going to listen to you.
Do you find that it's hard to develop a relationship with adolescents? I mean, do you find that there are some adolescents who are just, I don't want to do this, I don't want any part of this, and if so, how do you deal with that at that point A part of the counseling process? What do you do?
Well, generally, to answer the first part of the question, I don't really feel it's any different than building a relationship with anybody else. I swore to myself years ago, and this is an actual thing, I believe it impacts me now. I swore to myself years ago that I would never forget what it was like to be a child.
Ah.
And it gets harder
Uh-huh.
as years go on. It gets harder, but I really use that as a starting point with a lot of my adolescents and things like that. And if I realize that point, like they may be reluctant, they may be difficult, they may not want to be there. I've had plenty that don't want to be there. But really, I just keep approaching them from that perspective of, I understand what you're going through. I understand why it is this way. And I tell them that. I tell people, honest to goodness, I tell them that I swore I would never forget what it was like to be a child.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, I have to back that up with, my actions and reality. But
Right.
But
What you're saying is that you're trying to place yourself in their shoes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And how does that help? I mean, how does it help to, in the therapeutic relationship, how does that help for you to kind of place yourself in their shoes like that and to communicate that to them? How does that seem to help your work with adolescents?
Well, it's pure empathy. It's truly the idea that I am understanding and empathetic to the idea of what they're going through, and I can communicate that to them in a way that's meaningful to them. I'm very technology affirmative. When kids come in and tell me like, oh, I play video games and get on Facebook and do all these things, obviously there's balance to be had, but at the same time, I don't ever turn my nose up at that stuff or say, oh, why do you tweet, or why, I approach them from that that section of life, and kind of go from there. But realistically, goodness, like, it just helps a lot because they want to be understood.
Sure.
Everybody really at the base level wants to be understood, and that manifests itself in many ways, but especially kids. You think back to what it was like in high school.
Yeah.
Like, you're trying to form your own identity. You're trying to hammer that out, and everybody's trying to tell you what to do.
Right. Yeah. And the fact that this is an adult who's truly trying to understand them, and I'm talking about you in the role as a therapist now, as a counselor, that may be the first time that they've really had an adult figure do that, or really want to understand them, where they're coming from, and not to be maybe an alternative figure who's telling them what to do or how to do it.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that, and I agree, I think that's critical for that first part of the counseling process, just to help them to know that, hey, this person is really interested in me. They want to know what I think about things. And, when an adolescent client really senses that from a counselor, I think it really will help the relationship. So how do you take that and kind of run with it, so to speak, a little further down the path of this, from point A to point B, to get them to the point where, okay, they've developed this relationship with you, they seem to like you, they seem to be opening up. Now what? Now what happens after that?
Well, again, depends. My answer is going to be often it depends.
Sure.
But really, at that point, once I've developed that relationship, and again, this is not necessarily just adolescents, but in this context, hopefully they've opened up and they've realized that I'm no longer this authority figure that's telling them what to do, what to feel, what to think, and instead I'm exploring it with them.
Okay.
And at that point, so moving down the line from A to B, kind of in that middle ground, once we have that rapport, I do start helping them to explore those concepts. Why do they believe what they believe? Why do they feel what they feel? What are they
Mm-hmm.
what are they wanting out of life? What are they not wanting out of life?
Mm-hmm.
And um, honest to goodness, it sounds kind of corny, but I do a lot of Socratic questioning with them. Like the idea of I don't know, I don't know that you know. Let's explore it.
All right.
So that kind of concept, and I've had a lot of good success with adolescents because it helps them to formulate certain ideas, but then it also makes them defend it.
Yeah. So
You know?
really, it kind of, what you're saying now is after you form that relationship and you've helped them to understand that you really understand them, you respect them, that at this middle phase of counseling, you kind of move into what you were talking about earlier in the podcast about kind of looking at what their beliefs are, what their thoughts are about different things, and maybe even looking at the reality of the situation that they're in. Maybe it can't change, maybe it can, but what are their thoughts and their beliefs about that whole thing. And so what do you do with that? I mean, once you start questioning, you said the Socratic questioning, so you're just kind of asking a lot of questions about their thinking and their beliefs. What do you do with that to kind of help them change or get them to a point where they're doing better?
Sure. So within that concept, obviously I don't ask too many questions, but the idea being that it's more of it's an exploration, making them, I don't make them do anything, but I allow them to tell me why they feel this way, and then again start exploring that concept. And then I offer possible alternatives. I offer ways to continue building that, the reality style stuff where you move towards, and is what I am doing getting me to where I want to be. And I use that a lot with everybody, but it really resonates a lot with I'd say, adolescents in general, but, a little bit older, probably, the teenage adolescents that do know that life is going to start moving along.
Yeah.
Like they have to figure out what they're doing, and they've heard so many different things from everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
They aren't sure. And then that even applies to adults, not adults don't have a monopoly on understanding the world. We don't, and the idea being is it really does help just to simply conceptualize things is what I am doing now getting me to where I want to be. And that is very A to B, obviously, like you're talking about, and it really helps people solidify that.
Yeah. So
and then exploring what that means otherwise.
Yeah, so there's a lot of exploration that goes on, a lot of discussion about not only how they think about things, but what things mean to them. What are their what are their goals in life? I mean, I think that you brought up the whole point of identity, and I think you look at this stage of life. And who knows what they want to do? I mean, you and I were talking at the beginning of the podcast about, some ideas that, when you were in high school, maybe you wanted to be a counselor or something like that. But I think for most people at that age, they have some really vague ideas of what they want to do. But a lot of that depends on answering the question, who am I?
Mm-hmm.
Who am I? What's important to me? What kind of person do I want to be? I mean, some of those really basic critical questions. I mean, Erickson talked about this in his theory of psychosocial development, where the main task of this time of life is answering that question, who am I? And it sounds like there's a little bit of that figures into your work with adolescents too.
Oh, no doubt.
Yeah. And I think the other thing, too, that likely comes out of this is when you are having these conversations, you're doing these explorations, you're asking them about their thoughts, their beliefs, that, when they come in at that point A, they might have a particular way of thinking about things that's very rigid, that, this is the way it is. There's no other way of looking at it. But I think from what you do in your work, I think you probably get them to the point of getting them maybe unstuck and maybe looking at things from different perspectives. And maybe that's what leads to that success in what you do with clients.
Oh, absolutely. I fully believe that being unstuck, as you said, is a major point. Just to kind of illustrate that idea, there's a story that I often tell, and I won't make it long, but
Uh-huh.
it's an illustration, I suppose, more that I use with everybody. Like there's a ton of people that I've used this with, and I encourage people to go out and tell it to their friends and all sort of other stuff. But it's the idea of how fast thoughts and beliefs can change everything else around you.
Mm-hmm.
And so the way I started out is, suppose you're at a grocery store, or you're in line somewhere waiting to check out, and a fellow comes running in the door and kind of nudges you out of the way in your line and just snatches a soda right out of the machine next to you and just runs out the door.
Mm-hmm.
And I always ask people initially, like, what are your initial gut reaction, thoughts, feelings, all sort of stuff, and you get all sort of answers like, oh, he stole that, and I feel angry, or
Yeah.
I'm indifferent, it's not my problem, or you get the one person every now and then that says, oh, I'd chase after him, or maybe you get the people that are like, well, maybe he's hungry, maybe who knows, and you get all sort of different stuff, but it produces a feeling, it produces these feelings and behaviors and
Yeah.
such. And the way I change it up, and I tell them at that point, I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to change your thought process right now, instantaneously, and that's going to change how you feel about it.
Uh-huh.
They're like, okay, right. So I say, okay, well, you finish up, you check out, you walk outside, you see the same guy kneeling over an old lady, and he has realized that she's either diabetic or is going into some kind of shock or something, something. And he's trying to administer basic first aid while the EMTs arrive, right?
Uh-huh.
And then, I ask immediately, well, now what do you think? Oh, well, he's a hero, he saves someone's life, blah, 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 and that's instantaneous. It changes everything based on what you previously believed versus what you now believe based on your own observation.
Uh-huh.
And I use that.
Yeah, and I think that makes total sense. I mean, that's a very good illustration to show how the way that your perspective on things, or the way that you think about things, can really impact the way that the way that you feel. In the first scenario there, I was just kind of thinking about that myself, and I was thinking, well, I'd probably be pretty ticked off if a person did that. I'm not sure I'd run after him, but I would probably say a few choice words to him if they did that. But then again, you look at the second scenario there, and then you think, oh, okay, now I understand, and so that really changes the way that you feel. Well, probably not only change the way that you feel, but maybe how you would handle the situation. Maybe when you saw that you would offer help as opposed to calling the guy names and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's a very good illustration. Well, in your work with adolescents, let's just stick with them for a second. What are your challenges in working with this population? Because you often hear that, as a counselor, that it can be difficult, it can be challenging to work with this population. What have you found to be some of the challenges in working with adolescents in particular?
With adolescents in particular, it is very often the challenge of, you don't know me. Quote, quote, you don't know me, you don't know what I'm going through, stuff like that. And that's the initial hurdle, I suppose, to get over, and that's why I said what I did previously or early in the podcast. Like, I have to overcome some of that by inviting and, showing them that it's okay, so that's a big challenge there. Another one might be, honest to goodness, there's a lot of people that have a lot of history and a lot of baggage.
Yes.
There's a lot that you kind of have to slog through, and it can be time-consuming and difficult. Sometimes people don't want to hear it. Often as counselors, and I hear this often in regards to specifically adolescents, the idea that, oh, they're just so illogical and they don't understand the real world, and they're just, they're just obstinate about all sort of stuff, and that's kind of the idea. That's what I hear from a lot of people that say, oh, I don't work with adolescents. That's why, I like cognitive stuff and they don't do cognitive stuff. And I don't think that's true, but, that is a challenge, overcoming a lot of that, or if they're not ready,
Yeah. And I think that, it's almost as if, from what I heard you say, to kind of describe this, it's almost like they're putting you in a position of having to prove yourself,
Right.
in a sense, as a counselor. And I guess the proving is this going to be just one more adult that is going to tell me what to do, how to do it, or are they going to be different? And some adolescents may not even think that. Some adolescents don't even care whether or not how you're going to turn out to be. They just don't want to interact with you. Period. And I think that you're right. I think that it takes a special person to deal with an adolescent client. I mean, they have their own unique challenges, and it really does. And I appreciate you saying that. Your personal goal is to try not to lose that perspective of what it's like to be a child, or in this case, an adolescent. Because once you lose that, I think that will take away from, first of all, your ability to truly understand them, and second of all, take your credibility away as a counselor too.
Absolutely. And that's absolutely true. Like, that's again why I do that. And I think parents forget. I think they forget that a lot too. Even though we've all been children, they forget that a lot. And kind of relating it back into another challenge, sometimes it's not even the kids that are the challenge. Sometimes it's the environment. Sometimes it's, and this is the hard truth for a lot of people, but sometimes the parents are the ones that are presenting a challenge. Why would the kid change if there's no reason to do so? Or why would they change if there's no incentive to do so? Or if everything's going great for them, why would they stop throwing tantrums every time they want candy? Or stuff like that. So there's a challenge there as well. And I do believe a lot of people forget that. And I think the core idea is that sometimes you just don't understand,
Yeah. And I think there's a lot to be said, about the perspective of our social worker friends who've been trained in a systems perspective to take those things into consideration, because a person just doesn't do these things in a vacuum. I mean, there's a reason that they're behaving, or that they developed the way that they have, and they've developed in the context of a family system. And I think that's always, and I agree with that, I think that's always an important thing to keep in mind, and even to work with the parents if it's necessary. Oh, yeah. Well, Cameron, why is it that a person would want to come and see you for counseling? If it's an adolescent, why is it that they would want to come and see you as opposed to Joe Schmo, the other counselor down the street who also works with adolescents? Why should they come and see you?
Well, that's a large question, but generally speaking, I'll give you some stuff that people have said in the past.
All right.
Generally speaking, and as you are aware, males are a minority in the helping professions.
Yes.
That's a big thing. I've heard, honest to goodness, so many times, and usually with adolescent males.
That's right.
Usually you get the whole, like, moms calling in like, I don't know what's going on, but I think he'd really respond well just to having a good male figure that he could feel like he could talk to.
It's very common.
Right. And, I don't believe that women can't talk to adolescent males. I believe any good counselor or good, mental health practitioner, let me say, any good mental health practitioner will be able to approach most clients. But that being said, that is a big thing. People sometimes just want to talk to a male, or they have their own transference issue. Transference issues, like they come in and they're like, oh, I really feel comfortable with a male, or whatever the case may be. The other one, I'm not young, but I'm definitely, younger. And that's the idea. Oftentimes, adolescents especially, and even other adults that are, young adults that are starting out life, they identify with that. And again, that's not necessarily to say that other people can't, but sometimes that's a big thing too. I'm young, I'm male, and the other big thing that I think is a particular draw for me is, one, the adolescent part, but two, I'm very technology affirmative and very open to many, many aspects of life. You get the parents that say, oh, well, our video game's killing my kids. Well, Maybe, but probably not.
Sure.
Is the phone a problem in my life? Well, again, maybe, but probably not.
Yeah.
It's kind of the idea there. I'm very technology affirmative, and that gets a lot of people to open up. I also very much try and follow multiple cultures and styles of life, like whether it be countercultures or the minority cultures of different groups, whether they be the quote unquote emo kids at high school,
Yeah.
or the marginalized folks at their job, or whatever that may be. And I think that's a particular strength of mine as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very able now, I don't know that I always was, but I'm very able now to divest myself of a lot of judgments and values that have no place in the counseling environment. I always say, and I tell people this too, like, when you walk in that door, you are first and foremost my client and a person.
Mm-hmm.
That is the basic idea. I don't have to condone or condemn the person. It doesn't mean I agree with the actions or the behaviors or whatever they're doing.
Right.
But I can absolutely value them as a human being.
Mm-hmm.
I tell people that, and sometimes it just takes people understanding that they're not, a monster, with an arm growing out of their head or something.
Right, exactly. So really, there are a lot of things that you have going for you. You're young, you're male. Like you said, that in this field of counseling, that males are a minority, especially males who see adolescents. That you're right. I mean, I can't remember how many times over the course of my career that I've gotten calls from moms or dads wanting a male therapist for their adolescent boy to see. And the same with girls. I've even heard with my therapist friends who've made the same comment that their moms or dads wanted their daughter to see a female counselor for same idea, that they think that they could relate better. But also for you, the fact that you're technology savvy, that you have that kind of same interest that a lot of adolescents do nowadays, and the fact that you're open to different people of different cultures, whatever the culture may be, and people who have different beliefs or whatnot. So I think that there's a lot there that would really draw a person to see you. So Cameron, if a client or a parent of a potential client wants to see you for counseling services, how can they get a hold of you?
Well, any kind of different ways. I've got a direct line that I always try and keep around me. I obviously am one man, but I can't, always get to a phone. But I do have a direct line, and that number is 615-476-7598. And like I said, that's a direct line. We do have an office line for the Counseling and Relationship Center of Murfreesboro, but I always tell people the quickest way is to do the direct line.
Okay.
And that'll get to me immediely.
All right.
I do have an email address that is my professional email address as well. Anyone can always feel free to answer, or rather ask questions, I suppose, or seek out information, or set something up. And that is Cameron, CAMERON, at crcmurfreesboro.com. And CRC being Counseling and Relationship Center, just the abbreviation there. So that's the two main ways to do it. Additionally, I do have a Psychology Today profile.
Okay.
You can go on to Psychology Today and look in the greater Murfreesboro/Rutherford County area, and if you type my name in, Cameron Carpenter, it will usually pop me right up.
Okay, and the Psychology Today is it's basically a directory. Is that correct? A directory of therapists in the area. And so if you go to Psychology Today, I'm not sure if that's what it is. We'll look that up and put that in the show notes. But if they enter your name, they'll be able to see, I think, a picture of you and maybe a description of you, so they can learn a little bit more that way too.
Absolutely.
So we'll put your contact information in the show notes. So if anybody wants to get a hold of you, they can do that easily. Awesome. Well, Cameron, thanks so much for joining us today. It sounds like you're off to a great start in your career, and sounds like you have an affinity for adolescents, but that you see people of all ages, and that that you're open to doing that. And it sounds like things are getting off to a good start. So we're excited to see how things will turn out in the future.
Well, I appreciate you doing it.
Okay.
So,
Thanks so much for joining us today, Cameron.
absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. All right, that was great information that Cameron provided to us in this interview. You know, it's not an easy thing to counsel adolescents. I've counseled them for many years, and I think the thing that Cameron had talked about in the importance of establishing the relationship so they can trust you, and that setting the foundation, I think that that's a real important aspect of adolescent counseling. And also just kind of talking to them about the way that they look at things, that they perceive things. In fact, I think that the takeaway I got out of this is that the way that people think about things affects the way that they feel and behave. Cameron had talked about how adolescents with mental health problems can benefit from looking at things from different perspectives, and we had talked about how this helps them get unstuck. Not automatically thinking that their perspectives pertaining to a situation, which could be off base, could be unrealistic, are the correct ones. So a lot of good information in this interview. Well, if you'd like the show notes for today's interview, please visit my website, chrisquarto.com. And once again, please get the word out on the Make a Mental Note podcast on Facebook and Twitter. I think a lot of people would really like these podcast episodes. Have a great rest of the week.